Mary Day was only 13 years old when she disappeared from her family's home in Seaside, California, but her case is one of the longest enduring and strangest cases I think I've ever covered on this podcast. Not because the case went cold, but because it wasn't even a case until 2002. Former Seaside Police Chief Steve Cercone told 48 Hours, quote, "I can't remember a time when a child was not reported by the parents, and yet that's exactly what happened to little Mary. She disappeared and was never reported missing until her sister came forward years later to get police on the case, which meant that without Mary's sister's intervention, her existence could have been completely erased. Now, of course, suspicions did turn immediately to Mary's parents, suspecting that she had met a horrific end when she had gone missing back in 1981. But did she? Because in 2003, Mary Day came forward to reclaim her identity. But did she? What actually happened here? Hello, I'm Anna, and this is episode 42 of the Crime Bistro podcast, where we are diving into one of the most fascinating cases that I think I've come across recently, and one that I am really excited to talk about and share with you today. This is the case of Mary Day, a missing person who was found after 22 years, or not. We'll get into all the details, but first, of course, this is not an episode that you can be sleepy for. We are going to need some caffeine for this one. So right now, I do have with me a breakfast blend coffee. I'm being boring today. It's okay. Grab your own coffee, caffeinated beverage, or emotional support water bottle, and let's go ahead and get into the bizarre case of Mary Day. Mary Louise Day was born on February 19th of 1968 in Little Falls, New York, to her parents Charlotte and Charles Day, but at the beginning of her life, Mary wouldn't actually spend too much time with her parents at all. She had two younger sisters who were named Kathy and Sherry, and all three girls were placed in foster care from a very young age because their mother could not take care of them. Sherry was adopted by her foster family, but Mary and Kathy would be returned to their mother. Sherry would later say in an interview that she was separated from her siblings when she was only 6 years old, which is heart-wrenching to imagine. Before they had been returned to Charlotte, however, their mother had divorced Charles, their father, so Mary and Kathy would be returning home to an entirely different situation. When Mary and Kathy had returned to their mother, she had gotten married to a man named William Hoole and had two other children with her new husband. William Hoole was in the Army, so the family did move around quite a bit within the United States, of course, to different bases, which is pretty typical for military families. What wasn't typical, though, is that William had horrifically been reported of physically abusing young Mary. Now, I'm not sure who made this report, but it was serious enough that Child Protective Services actually took custody of Mary for a time, and this happened in December of 1980 while they were all living together in Hawaii. She would later be returned to the family like nothing had ever happened, which is so disappointing, and reports of Mary mentioning extreme physical abuse at the hands of William Hoole throughout the time they spent together kind of run rampant in this case. So the report that was made in Hawaii doesn't seem to be an isolated incident. They would eventually all move to Seaside, California when William Hoole was assigned to Fort Ord, which is located on the coastline north of Monterey. At the time, Seaside was kind of a military town in the same sense that like Knoxville is a college town, if that makes sense. It wasn't officially a military town, but most of the people who lived there were associated with it. Mary disappeared around July 15th of 1981 from her family's home in Seaside. We only have an approximate date here because Mary was never reported missing by her parents, and they really just didn't seem to care that she was gone. It was really like she had never been there at all. And it really is just so heartbreaking because Mary was so isolated by her parents that it wasn't even that she was just gone. It was like she had never existed. She didn't know any of their neighbors at the time, so they wouldn't have noticed that anything was amiss. And she also wasn't enrolled in school in California either. It was early 1981 when the family had made this move to Seaside, and Mary only went missing a few months later, which meant that the family really had not been there long enough to be able to have established any real ties to the community. After Mary disappeared, Sherry, who was the youngest sibling who had been adopted by her foster family, decided to go and visit her family in California because she had been keeping up contact with them, except Mary wasn't there. So concerned for her sister, Sherry asked where she was and what had happened to her, and she would later say in an interview that when she asked this, their sister Kathy said, quote, "Shh, don't say anything. We're not allowed to talk about Mary," end quote. And I just need to say that no matter how many times I read that quote, listen to it, or even just think about it, I get chills up and down my spine. It is so unbelievably sinister. Other than that, all Kathy said was that Charlotte, their mother, had told her and the two children that she had had with William that Mary had run away. And what's truly devastating about this case is that that actually was not implausible to consider at the time because Mary had tried to run away on multiple occasions to get away from this family because of the alleged abuse that she was suffering. Unfortunately, Mary would go unreported as a missing person for a very long time after that, but as Sherry was growing up, she just couldn't shake this persistent feeling that the explanation that Mary had simply just run away didn't sit right with her, and the more she thought about it, the less sense it made. It was Sherry who would officially make the missing persons report for Mary Day in 1994, and of course we would all hope that she would have just made this report all of those years ago, but you have to remember that she was a child and she was also the youngest sibling. She trusted what her mother was telling her, and she listened to her older sister when she was told not to talk about Mary. Witnesses are never perfect, and children, while they do rarely lie in investigations of this nature, cannot be expected to make a report like this about their own sister. Not to mention, she wouldn't even know who to go to, who to talk to first, or where to even go, etc. And it's just not reasonable to put the burden of not reporting something like this on a child. And not to mention, the idea that Mary really might have just run away honestly was relatively believable at first, since it would not have been the first time. The initial report that Sherry made to police in 1994 wasn't really looked into, and I can't really find a clear reason as to why. I mean, at this point, it was a 13-year-old case, and there really weren't any credible leads to follow since no one had seen or heard from Mary in that entire time span. So maybe they just didn't think it was a credible report. But if it were me, the fact that it had been so long and that there was such a lack of evidence would raise major alarm bells, and I would want to investigate that right away. But apparently, that's just me. With no answers, Sherry filed another report, this time in 1999, to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, also known as NCMEC, which, just as a side note, is an incredible organization, and I really do recommend looking into it if you're not familiar with the work that they do. At the time, NCMEC had put together an age progression photo of what Mary might have looked like at the age of 31. That all being said, though, that's kind of why this case went unreported and out of the eyes of law enforcement for so many years, 21 to be exact, because even though NCMEC was on the case, the Seaside Police Department did not launch their investigation into Mary's disappearance until 2002, and it was because of NCMEC's involvement with the case that they even reopened it at all. With so much time having passed, with no record of Mary being in school, no neighbors that could remember her, and literally no leads, this investigation definitely started out very, very slowly. However, it would be hard to not address the elephant in the room as a detective. Why did Mary's parents never report her missing? because you don't have to be a detective to recognize that's incredibly alarming and definitely circumstantial enough to at least consider her mother and stepfather suspects or persons of interest in this case, which is kind of what happened. I mean, they were really the only people who police even had to question or look into at that point, and investigators did discover an alarming motive very quickly. You might notice that I have not mentioned Mary's birth father, Charles, since the very beginning of this episode, which is because he really wasn't in their lives for very long before he tragically passed away in an accident while Mary and the family were living in Hawaii. What this meant, however, is that Mary was receiving government checks because of this accident that her father had died from. So Charlotte and William had every reason to not report Mary as missing, because if they did, there's the possibility that these checks would stop coming. And the more disturbing aspect of this as a potential motive, it does make me speculate that Charlotte and William were worried that these checks would stop coming if Mary herself was deceased. And it does make me think that there is a possibility of her having passed in 1981 when she was last seen, which is just devastating to think about. And again, everything is alleged here, but it's important to note that Charlotte and William did keep cashing these checks even throughout the time that Mary was missing. Police did pick up on the sketchy behavior of Charlotte and William, and in any investigation of this nature, you obviously need to start with what you know, which in this case was that Mary Day was last seen at the home in Seaside. So in 2003, Kathy returned to that home with the police. Kathy recalled that she was only 11 years old the last time that she saw her sister, and in an extremely emotional interview with 48 Hours, she was able to recount her final memories of Mary. She said that Mary and Kathy had been left alone at the house one night while the rest of the family had gone out, and horrifically, while they were gone, the family dog had gotten extremely sick, kind of out of nowhere, and was in the kitchen in really bad condition when everybody did return home that night. Since there is a history of reports being made against him, I do think it's safe to assume that William was a very volatile and violent person, but what happened next is just unfathomable. Kathy recalled that he accused Mary of poisoning the dog, and he backed her into a corner and started hitting her over and over again. Kathy would later say, quote, "Last time I saw her, she had blood coming out of her mouth." And this wasn't all that Kathy remembered. She also recalled that after Mary had disappeared, William and Charlotte had told all of the kids to stay away from one particular spot in the backyard of their own home. The implication here is absolutely terrifying, and it's possible that William had killed his stepdaughter in this fit of rage that he had been going through, and that her own mother had agreed to help him cover up the horrific crime by burying Mary's body in their backyard. Steve Cercone, a member of the Seaside Police Department, had a very important part into the investigation of Mary Day, and he posited that same thing after speaking with Kathy about what she had remembered. So the police did decide at that point that it was necessary to bring in a team of cadaver dogs to search the backyard. Cercone explained what happened that day, saying, quote, "As the dogs went into the backyard, they each hit on one particular spot near a tree," end quote, and there were 4 dogs in total who all alerted to the exact same spot. Cercone then continued, saying, quote, "We started to dig. As a father, my heart was pounding, and as we dug, I saw a little girl's shoe. My heart started pounding even more, and I thought, here we are, we found her," end quote. This was a Ked sneaker that they had found buried in the yard, which Mary's sisters would later confirm that they did own. Strangely, though, this sneaker was way too small for a young teenager and was more likely a toddler's shoe. But as the investigators continued digging in that spot, they eventually realized that there was nothing there. No sign that Mary had been buried there back in 1981. I do think that it's relevant here to talk about cadaver dogs a little bit, just for those who don't know too much about them, But cadaver dogs are highly trained, they are highly intelligent, and they really aren't wrong all that often. In fact, trained cadaver dogs are 95% effective at picking up scents of human decomposition, including bodies that are buried up to 15 feet deep, and each dog will receive about 1,000 hours of training before they are considered ready to work. In fact, at the time that police were digging in the backyard of Mary Day's home, the dog handler himself was so confident that they had hit on human remains that he said the only explanation for there being nothing there was that there had been a body there and that it had been moved. At this point in the investigation, the police had not yet spoken to William and Charlotte themselves since they did not live in Seaside anymore, so they did have to track them down. In 2003, the couple was still together and they were living in Kansas, where William was working as a corrections officer at a prison, which is slightly ironic. Charlotte did agree to talk to the police about Mary, so they brought her in for an interview, which was recorded. Steve Cercone was present for this interview, and he said that the police felt very strongly, very quickly, that Charlotte was hiding something from them. Because the interview was recorded, we do have actual quotes from Charlotte, one of which was particularly interesting to the investigators, where she said, quote, life is full of regrets. If you go back and say, if I had did this and this and this, end quote. She also claimed that she had last seen Mary in 1981 and that she had just assumed that Mary had run away, citing the fact that she had tried to run away from the family before, though under circumstances like this, it obviously didn't seem as believable as it might have 20 years before. Police asked Charlotte whether her and William had done anything to try and find Mary, and all she said was that they should have. And as she was pressed on this, she then claimed that William had told her that he had filed a police report at the time, but that if they did file one, she didn't remember doing it, and there is no record of any kind of report like this ever existing. And William, when he was interviewed, gave a very different version of events from the night that Mary went missing from the version that Kathy had already given to police. He told the detective who was interviewing him, whose name was Joe Bertania, that they had gone out that night, leaving Mary and Kathy home, and when they got back, he went to check on the two girls and was shocked to see that Mary wasn't in her bed. Luckily, though, Joe Bertania did kind of put the heat on William as he was questioning him, and he asked William why he had been so panicked about Mary being missing if she was constantly trying to run away. Shouldn't this have been something that was kind of routine and almost at that point expected? This question really threw William off, so his story did change very quickly. In the second version of events that he gave, he was so upset that he thought his dog had been poisoned that when Mary had tried to run away, he held her back and physically attacked her, saying that he had hit her repeatedly and that he had even at one point strangled her. And yet, he claimed that he hadn't killed her, but that he had just been angry enough to viciously attack a 13-year-old. Detective Bertania was incredibly alarmed by the admission of such intense rage towards this young girl, so he told William, quote, "You're this angry, I think you may have killed her." And to this, William said, quote, "No, I didn't kill her. But the next day, my wife Charlotte told me that night she saw Satan in my eyes, and she said that I was possessed by a demon," end quote. At that point, Joe Bertania asked William, quote, "Okay, William, I believe you. You didn't kill her. But what about that demon inside of you? Could that demon have killed Mary?" And William looked the detective straight in the eyes and said, "Yes, the demon could have killed her." Detective Bertania would later reflect on this day, saying that he was certain that when William left the station that day, he was watching a killer walk away. Now, this wasn't exactly a confession in the traditional sense, but it was definitely an admission of guilt, so police were still trying to build their case when something happened that would turn the entire investigation upside down, literally. Mary Day was found alive in Phoenix, Arizona in November of 2003, only 7 months after William and Charlotte had been questioned in April of that same year. She was a passenger in a truck that had been pulled over for having stolen license plates, so her identification was run through the system, as is normal for traffic stops. What wasn't normal, however, is that this ID hit on a missing persons database for a missing person named Mary Day. This woman had an identification card under the name Mary Louise Day. Police did think that she looked very similar to photos of Mary and that it was definitely possible that this truly was her. She claimed that she had run away from home when she was a teenager and that she had been living on the streets so that she could remain off of police's radar for so long. This woman was questioned about the night that she had supposedly run away, and she told police that she really didn't remember all that much, attributing this to her stepfather slamming her head into the bathtub and into the coffee table. She said, quote, "I don't know what's real or not. I remember he kept slamming my head into the tub and it hurt. I started bleeding and he hit my head on the coffee table. I think I blacked out. Maybe that's why I can't put all the pieces together," end quote. Detectives did find this a little suspicious though, as you're also probably finding this entire situation to be. This woman claimed to be Mary, but she wasn't able to provide any real details about Mary's case that could be pinpointed as something that only Mary herself would have known. She didn't even remember anything about the dog or the dog possibly having been poisoned. Detectives were incredibly suspicious, with good reason. 1981 to 2003 is essentially 22 years where there was absolutely no digital trace of Mary. No one came forward to say that they had seen her, and she went missing when she was only 13 years old. It is nearly impossible to imagine that a 13-year-old would have been able to scrape together enough resources to keep herself alive and away from anybody who could have recognized her. In fact, they were suspicious enough that they didn't even call her Mary Day. Instead, they called this woman Phoenix Mary, referring to Phoenix, Arizona, where she had been found. Police had been presented with this case that now only had 2 potential answers, so they knew that a DNA test on this woman would be the next logical step to take, and this test showed that the woman who claimed to be Mary Day was a match to the familial DNA profile of Mary Day's real mother, Charlotte. Obviously, this was completely shocking to police, but the DNA was a match, which meant that there wasn't really anything that they could do. A senior member of the police force in Seaside, Steve Cercone, said, quote, "I nearly fell on the floor. I couldn't believe it," end quote. The next part of this story is so creepy, but Sherry invited this woman to move in with her, hoping that they would finally be able to reunite and reconnect. But Sherry started noticing some things that really did not add up. The woman's accent was really strange. It sounded kind of southern and midwestern, but the family had never lived anywhere in the South long enough for her to have developed this accent. Not to mention, she was also getting magazines delivered with the name Monica Devereaux on them, but the woman was able to play that one off pretty easily, saying that she hadn't used her real name since she had run away. Investigators noticed the Monica Devereaux name as well, so Detective Joe Bertania did ask her about it, and the woman said the same thing, that since she had run away, she had not used the name Mary at all, and Monica Devereaux was the name that she had been going by since 1981. So Sherry was still feeling a little suspicious. It wasn't anything at this point that she could prove. It was more just an instinctual feeling that something was off, and their sister Kathy did feel the same way. Kathy was alerted that something might have been wrong when this woman couldn't remember a particular secret that the sisters had shared between them. They were set to receive an inheritance from their father's estate when they both turned 18, as a way to kind of give them hope for the future. When things were difficult, they were constantly talking about this between the two of them. Obviously, that's completely devastating to think about, but what's important here is that the girls had come up with a code word for this inheritance. They called it Mohawk. but the woman claiming to be Mary didn't remember this code word at all, which Kathy did think was really strange. But for the time being, these strange feelings were just that, strange feelings. No one could dispute the fact that the DNA had matched, so the investigation had to be considered closed at that time, but everything would change once again in 2008. That year, cadaver dogs were sent out to search Fort Ord, which was the army base near Seaside where William had been stationed, on a completely unrelated matter. Now, after Mary had disappeared, the family had moved to another home. This one was located on the base itself. So when the officers brought cadaver dogs inside of the home that William and Charlotte had moved to, out of hundreds of houses located in the fort that they searched that day, the cadaver dogs alerted to something in the home of Charlotte and William for the second time. If you remember from earlier in the episode, back in 2003, when this investigation was in its early days, police had taken cadaver dogs to search the corner of the backyard of the home that Mary had disappeared from, the spot that the other children were told they couldn't go near. And when the dogs alerted, they had dug and found a little girl's shoe, but didn't find any remains. So the dog's handler said that there must have been a body there and that it must have been moved. So now that cadaver dogs were alerting at a second location known to have been a residence of Charlotte and William after Mary had disappeared, they were very worried about what they might find there. But again, they dug up the area and they didn't find any trace of human remains, meaning that there were only two possible conclusions. The dogs had all been wrong on multiple occasions, which is extremely unlikely, but it is possible. Or option 2, that nobody wanted to be true, but that Charlotte and William had buried and dug up Mary's body at least twice to cover their tracks as they moved. Steve Cercone had recently been promoted to police chief in Seaside, and feeling that he really needed to take a further look into this, he decided to hire Mark Clark, yes, that was his real name, Mark Clark, a retired homicide detective, to give his input on this bizarre turn of events. As Mark Clark was looking over the evidence, he said, quote, "There's so many parts about this thing that could have solved the case back then. That is really frustrating," end quote. He came to believe that Charlotte and William had been let off the hook way too soon. Something that is really interesting is that Mark Clark consulted with the Body Farm, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a place for research where people whose bodies have been donated to science are studied. Basically, bodies are left in different outdoor locations around the farm to observe how they decompose, so that knowledge can be used in real cases to determine how long a victim's body had been there. It's really dark and really unsettling to think about, but it is extremely valuable research and has been a huge part of forensic science developments. This is relevant because in the case of Mary Day, Mark Clark consulted with the Body Farm, and they told him that soil samples from the backyard of the home where Mary had disappeared from were consistent with a body having been buried there at some point. Mark also reached out to Southern dialect experts to listen to Mary's voice, since the woman claiming to be Mary did have a Southern accent, and these experts did say that it would take about 9 to 10 years during Mary's formative years of living in the South for somebody to actually be able to develop an accent as thick as the one that she had. Officially at this point, though, because the DNA had been a match, this case had been closed. But this was a familial match, so essentially this type of DNA testing only proved that the woman claiming to be Mary was a daughter of Charlotte. So quietly, at first, detectives began to speculate. Charlotte had a history of infidelity, so it wasn't out of the question that she'd had another daughter at some point during her life. The timing of all of this did seem a little too convenient. In 2003, Charlotte and William had been questioned about the disappearance of Mary, and only a few months later, this woman had just appeared out of nowhere claiming that she was the long-lost Mary Day. Mary Day was supposed to receive this inheritance from her father's estate when she turned 18, so that does provide a motive for somebody to pretend to be her, and that does mean that it's possible that Charlotte got into contact with an old daughter of hers, promising her a piece of the inheritance if she had come forward claiming to be Mary Day, so that Charlotte and William could avoid any further questioning from the police. It's a lot to consider, but it's possible. It also wasn't a small amount of money that Mary's father had left to her, and with accrued interest by the time she'd come forward in 2003, it would have been about $60,000. Amidst all of this craziness and speculation, Phoenix Mary did move out of Sister Sherry's house after about a year in 2004, and she ended up moving to Missouri. There were speculative rumors basically that were relatively contained within the investigative units in Seaside, but in 2017, a new police chief named Judy Velez took over that department, and as many new chiefs do, she decided that she wanted to make her mark by putting all of these questions finally to rest. The key to finding out the truth at this point really did just seem to lie with the woman who was still claiming to be Mary Day herself. So another DNA test was done where it was discovered that not only was this woman's mother Charlotte Day, but her father was Charles Day, meaning that she shared the same parents as the original and real, I guess, Mary Day. Another issue that the police were dealing with was this legitimate Arizona state identification card that this woman had presented with the police back when she was first pulled over in 2003. At that time, she had only been in possession of the ID for about 3 weeks, and she said that she had gotten one with the help of a local nonprofit because she needed the ID to be able to access healthcare benefits for a gallbladder surgery. The police chief also wanted to learn more about the time that Mary was missing for, obviously, and how she had stayed under the radar for so many years. In trying to put the pieces together, she spoke with a woman who claimed to have taken in Mary Day when she was 15 years old, saying that she had stayed with this woman and her 2 daughters for an entire year before one day Mary was just gone. Police identified this woman who Mary Day had stayed with for that entire year as Maury Kimmel. This woman who Mary had stayed with was also able to provide a photo of Mary Day with her 2 daughters, a photo that was taken over a year after police had thought that Mary had been murdered. And to add another layer to it, experts in facial recognition technology have put the probability that this is really Mary Day in that picture at 99%, which is obviously very compelling. Things were now starting to look a whole lot different. Despite the questions that had been raised about the identity of this woman claiming to be Mary Day, it was starting to look like she actually was Mary Day. Her parental lineage matched. She had the ID card obtained using Mary Day's birth certificate. There was a photo of Mary Day a year after she disappeared, and a woman who corroborated Mary's story that she had stayed with her family when she was 15 years old. Even though her sister Sherry still didn't actually believe it, the story was shifting, and it really did look like this woman was truly Mary Day. And as you can imagine, assuming that Police Chief Judy Velez was correct, Mary Day had been discovered alive and healthy after 22 years of being missing. Honestly, it's so rare. It's unbelievable. It's really incredible to think about. In and of itself, that's just insane, right? But after all of that, none of her sisters even believed that it was truly her. She wasn't welcome back, but she was met with such extreme scrutiny. I mean, if she really is Mary, that is just beyond heartbreaking. Unfortunately, by this time in 2017, Mary had been diagnosed with cancer and her health was really starting to fail. Judy Velez went to visit Mary, knowing that with this late-stage illness, she probably wouldn't get a lot of other opportunities to speak with her. And after this conversation, Judy said, quote, "She wanted to convince us she was Mary, and it seemed sincere. She said she began calling herself Monica when she ran away because she didn't want police to take her back home," end quote. She also said, quote, "Honestly, when I talked to her, she just seemed like a survivor." And in terms of the gaps in Mary's memory that the original investigators had been so suspicious of, Judy Vella simply chalked it up to Mary's immense trauma and her issues with alcohol abuse from a very young age, which absolutely could both be legitimate reasons that she would have these memory gaps. So, with all of this information put together, the maternal and paternal DNA tests, Maury Kimmel coming forward to say that Mary had lived with her for a year, the photograph of Mary a year after police had thought that Mary had been murdered, her ID matching Mary Louise Day, the possible gaps in her memory, the age progression photo. I mean, when I say it like that, the evidence really does seem overwhelming, right? So Judy Vella submitted her final report and officially put the mystery to rest, closing the case. Mary Day had been found. There are still doubters, notably Mark Clark, who is the retired detective that had taken a look at this case after the initial DNA test. He said, quote, "I've seen the report. I'd be lying if it didn't make me second guess my investigation," end quote. But he just can't shake that interview with William Hoole, who claimed that it was possible that he had killed Mary back in 1981 in that fit of rage. And there are definitely still questions to be answered in this case. I will say I do believe that this woman truly was Mary Day, and based on the accounts of her horrific childhood with William Hoole, it does make sense that she would want to run away. It's nearly unfathomable to me that a young girl could survive on her own for so long, but that doesn't mean that it's impossible. The only real question left for me is the question of the cadaver dogs. 4 cadaver dogs hitting on the same location in Mary's backyard in Seaside, and then the police digging down and finding that sneaker. It's definitely strange. And even stranger is the fact that in a completely unrelated matter, a second home that was occupied by Charlotte and William had cadaver dogs hit that they had found human remains out of hundreds of other possible homes that were searched that day. We do know that even when they are extremely well trained, dogs do have an innate desire to please their owners, and in this case, handlers. So it is possible that the handler was inadvertently leading the dogs to hit in these places. Maybe, but the second home in an unrelated investigation, that does seem way too coincidental to be meaningless, right? I do think that the case of missing Mary Day has been officially closed, and I do believe that Mary was telling the truth from the moment that she was discovered in Phoenix in 2003. However, something about the cadaver dogs makes me think that there really could be more to explore here, especially since I wouldn't trust William and Charlotte as far as I could throw them. Could there be an entire other mystery to unlock here? One that hasn't even been explored yet? Just 9 days after Judy Vella's Seaside police chief interviewed Mary Day in Missouri and decided to officially close her case for good, Mary sadly passed away from cancer. Sherry, her sister, also visited to speak with Mary before she had passed away, and the two were finally able to reconcile. So it's sad, of course, to think that it had to take that long, but I do understand that Sherry and Kathy had trouble coming to terms with Mary's identity at first, especially considering that police were so adamant that she had been murdered all those years ago. It's unbelievable to think about what Mary must have been through, and absolutely incredible that she survived. It's such a testament to her strength that she took care of herself. She grew up to be an extremely smart and resourceful woman, and that after 22 years as a missing person, she was able to return to the world and reclaim her identity without fears of being re-traumatized by William Hoole. I will always wonder about the cadaver dogs, but I think that what we can take away from the story of Mary herself is just a tale of strength and perseverance and survival. She protected herself and took matters into her own hands, and that must have been so terrifying, and yet somehow she made it work. She kept herself safe and healthy, and she was able to return and reunite with her family and her sisters without the fears that they had been exposed to as children. It's truly amazing, and I cannot stress enough how rare it is when a missing persons investigation ends with the person being found alive. It does break my heart to think that no one believed Mary when she first came forwards. I mean, I can't even begin to imagine the emotional roller coaster and turmoil that would cause for her, but through it all, she stayed strong. I mean, what a truly incredible woman, and I truly hope that she is resting in peace. And that is the unbelievable, bizarre, and finally solved story of Mary Louise Day. I couldn't believe that I'd never heard of this case before, and I'm so glad that now I have, because this one was so fascinating to look into for this episode. If you've made it this far and you're still here, thank you so much for your support and for listening. And I really hope that you found this case as fascinating as I did. And please let me know in the comments if you have any theories on the cadaver dogs and like what on earth was happening there. But like I said, that is just about wrapping everything up for this episode of the Crime Bistro podcast. So I am going to leave it there. Thank you again so much for listening. And this episode is coming to a close. So as always, until next time.